Welcome everyone to the San Jose branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This is our regular third Friday meeting, and we've been having these for as long as I've been around. But I want to just do a little heads up. We may be taking a hiatus in the summer, so just watch for notices, because some of us, it might be time to restore ourselves. Anyway, I welcome you on behalf of the three on the coordinating committee. So that's Rowan, Joan Goddard, and I. And so we put these together. We take turns, and this is Anna, and other people support us in various ways, like the grannies. So the first thing we do in our meetings, we open the meetings with the raging grannies. If there's a copter in the sky, tell me why. If there's a copter in the sky, tell me why. If there's a copter in the sky, tell me how I'm safer. Try. If there's a copter in the sky, tell me why. If there are tanks in my street, tell me why. If there are tanks in my street, tell me why. If there are tanks in my street, tell me how I'm safer. Try. If there are tanks in my street, tell me why. If the sheriff rolls with armor, tell me why. If the sheriff rolls with armor, tell me why. If the sheriff rolls with armor, tell me how I'm safer. Try. If the sheriff rolls with armor, tell me why. Okay, so then here we go. This is now. Here's the one, and I'm going to let Rowan introduce.
So I took this wonderful song by Vicki Ryder and somebody else, which is at the very bottom of the page, and I can't remember, that was a gun violence song, and I thought, oh, I really like this idea, and so I turned it into a anti-police militarization song. We need to wake up. We need to rise up. We need to open our eyes and do it now, now, now. We need to build a safer future, and we need to start right now. We are a country that has a problem. The cops get tanks and choppers, and we ask, how can we build a safer future? Oh, we need to start right now. Our neighborhoods feel like war zones. Hearing rotors fill the night sky, it's scary. Wow, wow, wow. We need new laws to stop these weapons, and we need to start right now. Why do police need armored vehicles? No more war in our streets, and do it now, now, now. We need to build a safer future, and we need to start right now. Let's find alternatives to militarization deployed against our communities. Stop it now, now, now. Citizen oversight and accountability are the key to stop it now. So no more waiting or hesitating. We must rise up. Time to rise up, do it now, now, now. We need to build a safer future, and we need to start right now. We need to build a safer future, and we're going to start right now.
Our speaker tonight, John Lindsay Poland, has a presentation on law enforcement in San Jose, because we've become deeply militarized in recent decades, with larger negative impacts on people of color and in our communities. He co-directs the California Healing Justice Program of the American Friends Service Committee, has conducted extensive research on militarized equipment used by police in California and coordinated a recent report called Equipped for War and an advocate's toolkit for AB 481. We're going to learn about that tonight. So we will discuss what we can do to counter the institutionalized militarism of policing in our area. So please help me welcome John. Thank you so much for showing up and for giving us this presentation. It is entitled Militarized Policing in Santa Clara County.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's really great to see you all this evening on a Friday evening, showing real commitment. So, yeah, you heard a little bit about me. I live in Oakland, California. I work for the American Friends Service Committee. I'm a researcher and an organizer. So I like to get down into the data. I really like to understand how people are impacted, the people who are by any issue. I've worked for many years on issues of militarization in Latin America, U.S. military policy and human rights issues in Latin America with human rights movements, doing accompaniment, doing advocacy, doing research. And one of the things I want to say, I always kind of jump right into things that are going on right now. But you know, sometimes when people think about militarization, they think of it as a very recent phenomenon. And it's very interesting to listen to you all, because often what people experience as a militarized presence is not only about weaponry that is used by armies, it is also about behavior. It is about the way people are treated. It's about pain. It's about impunity for when people behave really badly and hurt other people. And those things are often experienced as a package. You can't always isolate, okay, this is militarized policing, right? Because they have a tank. Because, you know, when you think about the way this country was founded, like if, for example, around the Fourth Amendment, Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights in good part came about in response to the British occupation in the lead up to the Revolutionary War, when soldiers were billeted in people's homes. Armed men came into people's homes, into their families, and that was very harmful, very invasive. And so it was outlawed in the Constitution. That's a form of militarization. The way in which the Fourth Amendment has actually been eroded by Supreme Court decisions in recent decades that allows for searches of people in various ways. The technology has also contributed to this. Is an aspect of militarization. The attitudes that law enforcement bring when they are in a community where they do not live are also an aspect of militarization. So we're going to talk a lot tonight about equipment. That's what Barb said she's been learning about. But there are many other aspects to this. And we shouldn't lose sight of that the equipment, the weaponry is a material manifestation of something that has been completely normalized. So my story of this is when the Golden State Warriors won in 2000, might have been 2018, somewhere around there. And there's a celebration, you know, Oakland is really, really happy. And there were tens and tens of thousands of people out in the street in Oakland. And I live near the lake and I was biking. I'm not a basketball fan, so I was actually going to BART. And I get closer to the lake and I see in the middle of the street an armored vehicle and men dressed in black clothing with assault rifles. And I think, oh no, something bad really happened. And what actually had happened is that they were there because of the parade. And I went up to them and I said, they were from the city of Alameda. And I, at the time, knew the chief of the Alameda police and said, so what's going on? And they said, well, we're just here to protect you. Totally normalized. We're just here to protect you. The narrative that goes along with it too. This is copacetic. This is a good thing. You should think about it as a good thing. We're here to protect you. So the experiences you described were much more, most of them were much more unpleasant. But keep in mind too, that there are many people who are not having those unpleasant experiences and their lives are being militarized. So this is an article from the New York Times in, I believe it was 1914. And I use it because police militarization has been racialized from the start. Many of you know that police have their origins in part in slave patrols in this country, who because there were no full-time police during the colonial era and in much of the country in the decades leading up to the Civil War. In this case, it was the beginning of the US drug war when Southern sheriffs had 22 revolvers and they began to propagate the idea that Negroes high on cocaine deflected 22 caliber bullets. And therefore, they needed to increase the caliber of their revolvers to 38s. And so the foundation, the race foundation of police militarization goes very deep. And of course, this was actually even pre-World War I. But so it is not the kind of overseas war that we kind of think of, oh yes, and they bring back the equipment from that war, they bring it home. Yes, that is also happening as the United States has been an imperial power. And when WILPF was founded, you know, at that time, in that period, because of the overseas wars that the United States was waging, and not alone, but it was definitely waging them. And that comes home, right? Because of the systems of oppression and division in our own society. So I want us to have some historical perspective on that. Now I'm going to jump ahead to the 1960s and 70s when SWAT teams are created in Los Angeles, originally in response to the Black mobilizations in those decades. Black Panthers, the Watt uprisings, and then that begins to, in the 80s and 90s, begins to replicate much, much, much more. And as we've seen in the new Jim Crow, as the drug war grows, the use of SWAT teams also grows. And many of those SWAT teams, they're being used disproportionately, as this ACLU pie chart shows, in against BIPOC, Black and Latino individuals, but also used disproportionately to serve drug warrants. So I say this because the narrative of militarization is always about the worst case scenario. It is always about the situation in which you feel helpless, in which there's an active shooter, in which there's a terrorist incident, in which there's somebody who is out of control and not subject to reason. That's the narrative of the use of this weaponry and of this militarization. But the most common use is not that, because in our communities, those events, although they are all too common, no question, are not the norm. They're not the norm in policing, and they're not the norm in our own experiences as civilians. So I say that because if you go to any of the meetings next week around the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department offices, equipment, you will hear that narrative. This is why we need this to protect you. So in the wake of the uprisings in 2014 and in 2020, there have been attempts to at least make the military equipment that law enforcement has more visible, more transparent. Because up to now, while in California, assault weapons are illegal to own for you and me and to purchase and to sell, they are not illegal to own for law enforcement, including in their own private homes. It is not illegal for a law enforcement officer to personally own an assault rifle in California, and thousands of them do. So that's where this law comes in. There were 3 attempts. It's AB 41, as Paula mentioned before. And it is a law to regulate the military equipment used by law enforcement. When we say military equipment, we don't only mean equipment that is coming from the military, from the Department of Defense in what is known as the 1033 program. So yes, after the drawdowns in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of the gear that was sent over to those wars, as you remember, there were hundreds of billions of dollars spent during those wars, and lots of stuff was sent over. The Iraqis and the Afghanis couldn't absorb it. And so it was brought home and sent to many, many police departments. But as our research has discovered, the majority of militarized equipment is not obtained that way. The majority of it is obtained either through purchase or through a cash grant, typically from the Department of Homeland Security. So this law applies to a list of militarized equipment from whatever source it is acquired. It applies to every single sheriff and police department in the state. And yes, in counties where the sheriff supplies law enforcement or contracts with cities that don't have their own police department, it applies to those cities as well. They can create their own policies. And what it requires is that these agencies have to publish use policies, and I'll get to that in a moment. It requires a disclosure of information about all the militarized gear that they have. And that had to be published in a publicly accessible website of the law enforcement agency by May 1st. San Jose Police Department did not quite make that. We'll come back to them in a moment, but they have now published their use policy. And then it requires approval of those use policies by city councils or county supervisors within 180 days of the publication, which means that these elected officials have 6 months to deliberate, to hear from community members, even go back to the police department if they want to, and rewrite, assign it to a committee, whatever, in order to make a decision before the use of that equipment will be affected. You will also likely hear, if you go to any of these public meetings, law enforcement will say, we want this done right away because we don't want to be without it. And you wouldn't, so we want you to approve this today, if possible. Most of them are saying that. Then, and every single governing body has so far, if they have made a decision, they've approved it. Some of them have decided to take a little bit longer time, which is a good thing, we think. But then if it's approved, every year, it's a repeating process. So every year, there will be a chance to review, to see, and to make a civilian decision about not only what law enforcement has, but how they use it. And that's critical because, again, a lot of times law enforcement will say, you don't want us to be without this, but that's a lot of times not the main issue. The main issue is you have it. How are you using it? How is it restricted? How is that use governed? Are there things that you can't do, or is it limitless? I'll come back to that. So I know this is a lot of text. I'll go through it. So this is what is before your county supervisors next week. It is a use policy for military equipment. And this is important also because most police departments and sheriff's departments in California use a private company to to draft their policies called Lexipol. Lexipol is made up of former military and law enforcement officials, and they sell their policies to police departments and sheriff's departments around the state. So for this very complex law, sheriffs and police departments are buying templates, if you will, from Lexipol. And as it happens, this key portion of AB 481 is not part of the template that Lexipol is selling to law enforcement agencies around the state. So this is what every law enforcement agency is required to include in their use policy. So the first piece is a description, and that's the disclosure part, the transparency part. Now we are getting eyes and light on assault rifles, armored vehicles, tear gas, so-called less lethal launchers, other types of gear, and product descriptions and how much and what it costs. That's number one and number three. Number two is the purpose and authorized uses. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because that's the thing around how is this thing going to be used in our community, if it's going to be used? What governs its use? What shapes law enforcement's decisions of what they can do and what they can't do with it? Similarly, number four is the rules that govern that use, and that could be legal. Then there's training. What is the training that's needed in order to use this equipment? Number six is very important and is omitted from almost every single military equipment policy that I've seen, which is how is compliance with this going to be ensured, right? I mean, you create a policy, you create a law that says you have to have a policy. Who's watching over law enforcement to make sure that they're really going by the policy that they submit to elected officials? And this requires identification of an independent entity that will have oversight authority. So that's really key. And then finally, how does the public complain, register concerns, ask questions? And most of these law enforcement agencies are setting up like a website or an email address where people can submit complaints or questions. Okay. What should we be asking about these use policies? You know, some of you brought up protests, you know, like having a sniper in front of a peaceful protest. Is that authorized under the policy? You know, they have these assault rifles, that they call patrol rifles or sniper rifles. Is it authorized to be used when there's a peaceful protest? When a lot of this stuff is used in SWAT operations, and a lot of those SWAT operations, they're not of the moment, they're planned, right? They're going to serve a warrant. A lot of times they go in the middle of the night or 4 a.m. And so what alternatives have been considered to that use? I mean, maybe the person they're trying to arrest goes to work and they can arrest them at work where there might not be children present. And that means you have to know something about where you're going. And so what information is gathered about that is very key if we want to prevent trauma that can occur when SWAT operations happen in a family setting or a neighborhood setting. And again, you know, if there are other children or other vulnerable populations, it could be people who have a physical disability, it could be people who have a mental disability, it could be people who, and again, this is the last thing on this list, people who don't speak English. So, you know, the officer is giving a command and the person doesn't understand it. What are the preparations that would happen in that case, particularly when people are scared out of their wits, right? Because of the equipment. And then, you know, how will there be any kind of distinction? And this could be in a protest or crowd situation too. Maybe there is someone who is conducting violent acts, and most people are not. So how will that distinction be made in however law enforcement responds? So let me take a look at some of the equipment. SCCSO is the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. And they have this, armored vehicle. Sometimes there are attachments that make it look a lot meaner. In this case, they got it from a Homeland Security grant. And in the case of the Sheriff's Office, the policy for deploying this vehicle does not specify what are the authorized uses. A lot of agencies, in this case, this is one, they identify for the section of the policy on authorized uses, they say this can only be used by SWAT, or this can only be used by someone with the proper training. So they are answering the question, who are the authorized users, not the situations in which use is authorized. And when you think about it, often it's a lack of discrimination of the situation where so much harm is done, right? Most people will accept that if there's an active shooter situation, that this type of vehicle would be okay. Some people don't. Some people say, no, they shouldn't have it. Because in fact, in most active shooter situations, law enforcement gets there after it is over, after the gunman has fled or committed suicide. But if they're going to have them, then the use should be governed in a way that really restricts it to the situations where it is appropriate in the value set of the community. So all of these agencies, almost all of them, have assault rifles. And in the case of the Sheriff's Office in Santa Clara County, they've got more than 300 of these rifles at a cost of more than $500,000. That was the acquisition cost. So mostly they are not coming before the supervisors right now to ask for more equipment, although there's an exception to that, which I'll get to. They are basically declaring the equipment that they have. And again, how it can be used, what is the permissible use of this equipment. Now, here is what they so-called less lethals. I think you made some mention of this, Rowan, of your friend who was hit by a rubber bullet. The impact projectiles have many names: baton rounds, rubber bullets, sponge rounds. There's a lot of different beanbag rounds, and there are different kinds, but they're all basically the same purpose. They're to immobilize people. They do hurt people. There's no question about that. And often law enforcement will say, well, this is so that we don't have to use a gun, so we don't have to kill them. These, in the case of Santa Clara County, are used in both the jail as well as in the community, and they're parts of their policy that apply to the jail. So if you think about how scary it is of being in a protest in an open air situation, think about someone in a cell who is being extracted from that cell. They don't want to come out, and this is what's used in order to forcibly bring the person out of the cell. Now, there is another new law in California called AB 48. You have 41 and then you have 48, a little confusing. But 48 applies to both these impact munitions as well as chemical agents, including tear gas. So those are what's known as the less lethal munitions, the impact projectiles and the chemical agents. And this particular law just came into effect, and it significantly restricts the use of these weapons, particularly for crowd control, only if there's a threat to life or serious bodily injury, only after objectively reasonable attempts at de-escalation have been attempted and failed, when there's multiple audible orders to disperse and time has been allowed to disperse. So, and that law enforcement has to discriminate again between those who are perhaps committing some violent behavior, which is not defined though, and those who are not, and just don't fire indiscriminately. And it prohibits the use of these weapons to enforce compliance with a law enforcement directive. So that's very important because a lot of times law enforcement gives commands, right? Lie on the ground, show me your hands or whatever, and the enforcement of compliance with that directive is not a reason by itself under this law to use that. However, this language is not adequately incorporated into the into the county's policies that are now being considered next week. The AB 41 also applies to drones and robots. The county sheriff's office, curiously, does not show any drones in its inventory. I say curiously because most law enforcement agencies, especially those of its size, have invested heavily in drones in the last few years. And as we'll see, the San Jose PD has quite a few. It does, the sheriff's office does has three robots, and they want to get another one. This diagram on the left is an illustration of it, with nearly $500,000 in Homeland Security funds. They don't have a surveillance policy yet for robots, which is very important because robots are used to go inside people's homes. They're used to go inside situations where they have cameras on them, right? And law enforcement is able to see inside people's homes. Presumably, in most cases, there is a search warrant of some kind, but they don't have a surveillance policy in place overall. And I mean, this law does not address that kind of tactic or that kind of militarization. But the other thing that your story for me highlights is it could be that wouldn't happen today because it's against the law. But it could also be that it does happen because sometimes the policies are in place and law enforcement they violate the policies.
They do it all the time in Oakland.
Of course they do. But these conversations in public with elected officials are one way to hold the civilian elected officials accountable. So I'm gonna come back to that in a moment. I just want to say something about San Jose. So several of you live in San Jose. They posted their military equipment policy only less than 2 weeks ago. They were late. And I was just looking at it today. There's not a public hearing about this policy yet. But I was looking at it today and it's very intense, the kind of armory that they have. I gotta say their use policies are better than the sheriff's, but their arsenal is overwhelming. So they have 3 armored vehicles, one of which is a former military vehicle, formerly owned by the Department of Defense, 2 that were purchased, Bearcats. One was a Rook, which I'm going to describe in just a moment, is another armored vehicle. Nearly 400 AR-15 rifles, other assault weapons, 11 submachine guns, 18 drones, 7 robots. I didn't count the tear gas and impact projectile launchers. They have a proposal to buy 2 more armored vehicles. One of them they're calling a medevac vehicle, and the other one is a Rook, which and this could be considered by the San Jose City Council as early as June, as late as November, because remember, the elected body has as much as 6 months. I will put this link to their proposed policy in the chat when we're done. But that I just wanted to say something about that, even though there's not a hearing coming right up, although there could be one within a few weeks. The Rook that I just talked about, there's a video online. If you go to YouTube and you search for the Rook, you'll probably see this. And it is a truly frightening vehicle because it's an armored vehicle that can destroy the walls of houses, that can pick up cars and move them. And it has this thing on the right, so you see this area in the front that has gun ports for up to 5 gunmen who are, they're protected by armor. And it can, that particular platform can raise up to 11 feet to go into the second floor of buildings. And this is for people who are hiding, right? Could be somebody who's having a mental health crisis, is in a home. People think he has a firearm, although it's not completely known. I mean, that happens all the time, right? So that's what they want to obtain for about $500,000. Come back to that question of the use policies need to have an independent entity for oversight. Neither San Jose nor the Santa Clara County Sheriff's proposed policies have that. Also, the authorized uses need to have real language, right? Like real things that actually define the limits of use. Because in many cases, for example, the Santa Clara County Sheriff's proposed policy for launchers, for these impact projectile launchers or for tear gas, they give you it gives you like a list of situations, and then it says includes but is not limited to these situations, which means it is limitless. There is no limit on the use, except of course the state law, which is not incorporated into the policy. So it's also important to define what are the prohibited uses. You talked earlier about peaceful protests, or for public relations. That should probably be prohibited. That's not a good impact in the community, or where a clear need for it is not defined, at the very least. So what else do I want to say about this? There's also an important piece here in these policies, which is, if you remember during the protests in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of law enforcement agencies went into other communities, right? So sometimes that meant the sheriff was called in. In Oakland, we had, I don't know how many departments that came in, including the sheriff's office, including other counties' sheriff's office, the deputies. And there are rules that govern that. But the question is, whose rules will be used if the sheriff, say, brings in a tank into a city? So
What's the matter, Bunny?
You could have San Jose PD, for example, could create a use policy for its armored vehicles. But if it allows the sheriff's office to use its own policies when it comes in,
What's the matter?
if people can mute themselves if you're not speaking, then there's no what is decided locally is not creating a structure or a guideline for that outside agency. And that's really when you want it, because they come in either for SWAT operations or when there are protests. Those are the primary ways in which you have outside agencies coming into a community, outside police agencies, to operate and bring their equipment. There's a couple other things here. The law requires a calculation of the cost, including the annual cost, but that doesn't usually include the personnel time for training and for other maintenance or whatever kinds of personnel time is required for the equipment. And that's often the most expensive thing, right? I mean, you might send it to the shop to get it repaired, and that doesn't cost something, but the police officers are well paid in our state. And so the personnel time is important to calculate. So finally, just want to say that this coming week, you have the opportunity to speak. I hope you will. The first one of these is next Tuesday morning, when the County Board of Supervisors will be hearing the sheriff's military equipment policy. And our objective at that meeting is to defer the item to the community advisory committee on this, which is known as CCLEM, because they are meeting 2 days later. And the supervisors should not consider a decision on this before they have formal community input from that body. Some of you may know Walter Wilson, who's the chair. I'll be doing a presentation that very similar to this one at that meeting on Thursday, the 26th. In both of those meetings, there is a time for public comment after the presentations of the item and before any decision is taken. You typically will have 2 minutes. You have to speak in a haiku. You have to, like I listened to y'all at the beginning, and it's hard to tell these stories in 2 minutes. So preparing is really good, really important. Like, the experiences are very powerful that y'all shared at the beginning and Donna just now. And in order to make the point that this policy has to be changed, it requires sharing something that is about your experience, as well as an ask, what do you want people there to do? So I will also put this into the chat, this link, because we have a toolkit that includes the links to these meetings, as well as talking points, as well as other information. So I'm gonna kind of leave it there in my show, and see what people, if people have comments, you have questions. Again, I'm going to put this stuff into the chat. We have an overall toolkit about this law, and about using it and going to hearings, and what information you can use, and how the law works, and what law enforcement agencies are required to do, and what the impacts of these militarized equipment is. And again, I'll stop sharing and put these links into the chat.
Okay, let's just do a big appreciation.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's almost overwhelming, but I'm glad we have the recording and all the slides and the information. So if you want, I will call on people and ask for questions and comments in haiku. I love that. That's a great metaphor. So does anybody want to ask a question, make a comment in haiku? Has her hand up, and we're going to hear a comment in haiku, Donna. This is going to be a challenge.
More time for the people to have policy regarding this stuff, because that's our tax money being spent, and we did not get our time to say, yes, we want our money spent this way or not. So that is a very wrong way to use our tax money to be able to come back and attack us.
All right.
Absolutely. One thing I would say, Donna, is to get more than the time of a haiku, y'all can also ask for meetings with your supervisors and or their staff. Because in a meeting, it might only be 30 minutes or whatever, but you get more time. And you can also explore with them, like, for example, Supervisor Sue Ellenberg is very sympathetic, very supportive. You can explore with them how to work on this, what should happen at the meeting, what points will be important for the supervisors to hear. And you can also tell them that, right? We really want the supervisors to hear this part of it. And they can get, you can begin to create strategies together if you have a sympathetic elected official. So, I encourage you also to look for a meeting like that.
And I also want to mention, John, that at least my county supervisor, Joe Simidian, has sidewalk hours, and he has them about once a month. and they're at a farmer's market. And I have gone several times. Very few people show up. So sometimes I've had the full half hour of his time. Because I don't like to stand that long. I'd much rather be sitting, but it's how it goes. But you can get their ear and find out what their thinking is on a particular issue. So just encourage you, get on their list. They'll send you a notice. At least mine does, sends me a notice when they're going to be at the farmer's market. So who's next?
I meant to also ask, I work, I cannot be at either of those meetings. Is there an email address that I could send comments to?
I think we might have that in our toolkit. I do think, yeah, it's really important to send messages to the supervisors. And, you know, if, depending on what hours you work, you know, maybe there's another time you can also call them. But yeah, we'll make sure that there's an email in there.
Yeah, we want them to represent us. Here we are. So be heard. So how about other questions, comments? Anybody? I'm looking for hands. Okay. And I think I see Anne raising her hand. Anne, I see your hand waving in the shadow of it anyway. Okay, unmute yourself. So I
here. There, I unmuted. Okay. Sorry, my picture comes and goes. Two things. One, this is a problem that goes way, 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 way back. In 1972, when I was a senior at UC Santa Cruz, I participated in a peace march that was perfectly peaceful. This was, I think, protesting Cambodia. Don't remember exactly what the issue was in terms of the Vietnam War, but it was my last year after I returned from working with the Farm Workers Union. Perfectly peaceful march that marched across Soquel Bridge and came back and then ended at the Pacific Mall. And as people walked back down Pacific Avenue, some whatever they were at the time started smashing windows of shops. And the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Tax Squad was called, and they went berserk. And I never heard any order to disperse, but I was walking down and starting to run down Pacific Mall, and I had one of those old green canvas book bags on my back, and it's a damn good thing I did, because some tax squad goon guy hit his baton across my back, slid open the book bag, book spilled out, but at least my back wasn't broken. And for decades, I kept that book bag as my personal testament to police brutality. And so ever since then, I finally got rid of it a few years ago. I'm sorry I did, because I would like to be able to wave it in front of the supervisors. As most of you know, I have been advocating for women's rights and civil rights and human rights in this county for 40 years. I've been an advocate, and I can, if it doesn't get sent now, I mean, absolutely, you should say, whether or not you can attend, you should send an email to your supervisor and copying the other 4 on it. So all 5 supervisors get your email before the meeting, and then follow up, you know, your testimony at the meeting, and then follow up again, and having meetings with a supervisor is a good idea. It's always a good idea to have the delegation led by somebody who's actually a constituent, but it can be people from other districts who come to all the meetings. So all of you are meeting with all the supervisors, and really, you know, I know all of the supervisors, and the only one that I have some concern about on this issue is Mike Wasserman, and he's about to be replaced because there's a new election, and at least two of the candidates running for District 1 would totally support our position. One, I'm not sure, and two, may well be opposed. But it's important that we not only get involved with the current supervisor, but the candidates who are running to replace Mike Wasserman, who's being termed out.
Okay. Joan Goddard, I see your hand.
Yes. Wonderful to see you, Anne. Please look to the private message in the chat. But the reason I put up my hand was that I'm wondering whether what we should be asking for at this point is for time, that they not make decisions, that the Thursday meeting group not, make recommendations yet, that there needs to be public time for public input. Is that a good way to approach it rather than trying to get into the nitty gritty of whatever they've put in writing so far?
Yes, I think so. I don't know yet whether CCLIM, these are long and complicated documents, and they intersect with other long and complicated documents. So there is a question of who is ready to do the deep dive. If the Community Corrections Law Enforcement Monitoring Committee, very long, CCLIM, I can see why it's called CCLIM rather than spelled out. If those folks are ready to say, okay, we want to take this on, we're gonna dig in, then yes, by all means, bring it back in another meeting to CCLIM. If CCLIM is not ready to dig in, then you could have another meeting where there's, it's also a question of what is our capacity to show up as a public. And when we don't show up is when they pass the shit, like that's when they do their dirty deeds, right? So, and I suspect law enforcement will be at these meetings, and it is a propaganda fest. Make no bones about it. It is a propaganda fest. I think it's, yes, more time is good, but particularly if there are people in the community and or key individuals in those, in the board or in CCLIM who want to take it on, with support from people like us, but, who really want to take it on. I don't know if that's a useful answer.
So there we've got our charge. I think you said, what is our capacity to show up? Because those who care on the PR policing side will show up. So there you go.
Particularly the police.
Yep. Okay, so showing up, but I want to just say that we're at 20 minutes after 8. Anne has a hand, and then we need to be wrapping this up, and Joan has a hand. So Anne, and then Joan, and then
I happen to have been in touch over the last few days with my friend Shirley Trevino, whom some of you know from her days either with the Agricultural Labor Relations Board or the Labor Commissioner's Office or the after she left the Labor Commissioner. But she's a good friend of mine who I've done labor issues with for 40 years now. But she was one of the original people at Santa Clara University who got involved with the police in San Jose and Santa Clara as a student and as one of the Chicano students in the Chicano movement. And they confronted the police 50 years ago. And we were just talking about what went down 50 years ago. So there's a long history in this county of issues with the police. And I will be in touch with Shirley about something else in the next couple of days. And I will certainly mention this to her. And I'm sure she's part of an active committee that's been planning a 50th reunion of the Santa Clara Chicano grads who were involved in the police brutality 50 years ago. So they likely will show up as well, and they would certainly be allies and provide some historic perspective on this.
Yep, this is a long road. Joan, you wanted to add something? Unmute, please.
Thank you. Yes, John, in line with the kind of thing Ann was just talking about, what other groups in the county are you aware of who are working on this, preparing to be involved?
So I think Walter Wilson at CCLEM may have a network of his own that he may involve. The Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, we've contacted Debug. We've contacted the folks at the San Jose Peace and Justice Center. I can't tell how much they are going to mobilize or respond. I really can't.
So
Somebody else.
when I do a lot of work with the city, I don't do a lot of work with the county. I'm a disabled person and it takes a bus and a light rail to get to the county building back before COVID when one did things, you know, but I do the city. And so when you send something to your city council member, you also send it to the city clerk. And so if there is something like that for the county supervisors, please be sure to note that, because if you just send it to your own city council member, it doesn't necessarily get into the record. If you send it to both a city council member and a city clerk, it gets into the record. And that's just really important to me, that if I'm going to take the trouble to write that email, to do that talk, I want it in the record. And so I just thought I'd mention that.
Okay, we got a lot of advice. Okay, well, Anne, I see your hand. And
They're all on, all the supervisors are also on Facebook.
okay, so this is, I want to just, you know, another round of applause. You know how that goes, a round of applause. Here we go. And for John and also deep gratitude for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your research with us. I have a sense we have just really touched the edges of all that you know and all your activism. It's nice to have you come and spend this 90 minutes with us on a Friday night. So a deep gratitude. And that brings us to the end of our WILF meeting. Just gratitude to everyone who came and participated, and particularly to John. I feel a little better informed than when I got here, and I also feel overwhelmed. This is a big issue. So thank you very much, John. And it's nice to see all the WILF sisters from near and far.
Thank you.
Yes, nice to see everyone.
Nice to see everyone.
All right, have a good weekend.
Good night.